Welcome to Al Ginkgo, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics, kindling knowledge synthesis.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome once again to you, Brother Leslie.
Thank you.
Abul Karim. I hear your name popping up now from time to time on the internet waves, both famously and infamously. Mostly the former, because I don't travel in those who label us infamously. I don't travel those circles. I try to avoid them, and I'm sure they try to avoid me, except when they're on the attack for whatever reason. Defensive measures people feel they have to take. I don't feel obliged to defend anything that I'm doing. I just do it, brother, because it seems to be part of the fitra Allah that is deposited in me. And I've made a few discoveries in some of the literature I've been reading this past week that some of us agree to do these things before we're birthed. You see, before we're born. So I'm of the opinion that I don't have any choice other than to pursue the path which is set before me. And I'm very honored that you are part of that endeavor. Alhamdulillah. Now, where were we? Well, we started off several months ago, following up your several theses, if you will, about what went wrong with the Muslim approach to jihad, individually and collectively as a body of, how shall we say, well, I use the word believers because there is an awful lot of belief going around that is not exactly based on truth, as we've been revealing it slowly and steadily through these interviews. Now, we were approaching the Middle Ages and some aspects of the Golden Age, but I thought we'd maybe take a step back before we get through that and approach the Ottomans and take a look at the madhabs. Remember, we had talked about this 2 weeks ago. I asked you to look into it and to prepare a brief oral dissertation for the sake of our listeners, because there are a lot of people who listen to folks like you and I, and they think they're informed, when in fact they're not, and they don't really come to appreciate the fact that they're not informed properly until they hear such interviews like this, just discussions between, a couple of old fellas here sitting around a campfire and chewing the fat and trying to figure out, hey, what went wrong with our tribe? I mean, why did we miss that big mama bear? And, we're trying to figure out what went wrong. Goodness me. And I think that the madhabs is part of that errant, I suspect, I don't know, from secondary and tertiary sources, because I'm an outsider. A brother by the name of Oloduso, you might have met him when he was a research fellow back in the day at ISTAC, is from Nigeria, I believe he was. He wrote the introduction to my book, The Cain's Creed. He said it was essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the history of the sort of global conspiracy that has become known as the New World Order, which is just the old world order updated to our modern experience. Anyway, Oloduso said, look, he said, it's like this. You read Dr. O and you've got a pretty good advantage because he's neither on the inside or on the outside. He's got a foot in both places. and that allows a certain objective perspective, which you're going to experience in these pages. And I was really honored to read that introduction. He went on a little bit, but this idea that, hey, I got one foot in and one foot out, but they're both firmly placed on the knowledge that I do have. And so I have these interviews with people like yourself to help me fill in the gaps, you see, along with others who are also interested in these same things. So let me tell you a little bit of what I think I know about the madhabs, and it's very little, believe me. Okay, I think that these old, I'm surmising now. Okay, based on what little I know of fiqh and other things, and Islamic history, Muslim history, if you will. It seems to me that these fellows just started out pretty much like you and I, discussing this, that, and the next thing. And they formed opinions. They weren't always in agreement, but they weren't at war with each other. Okay. That's my understanding of just a generic overview. And the wars or the competition, I'll use the, not war, I'll use competition. Okay. The competition started with the students who set these things up. And, 2 or 3 generations after you've got the original founders of these so-called madhabs, you have institutionalized oppositional parties. Okay, it's like they're all trying to take the front seat while they're on the back seat. It's, if I can use that analogy, it's just there's a fierce competition, and it didn't appear to be anything other than just normal fishwifery, if you will, if I can use that phrase, looking over the backyard and the fences, and as the ladies are hanging out their laundry, and they're saying this, that, and the next thing about so and so and such and all this sort of thing. And I just thought, well, gosh, this is kind of childish. And then I found out they still can't agree on how to pray 1,400 years later. And I say, well, gosh, that means they didn't know what they were talking about to begin with. You see? So this is my impression. Okay. Now, I know that most of our listeners never had that impression. Okay. Because most of our listeners have both their feet inside the tradition. So there's a certain bias that the ability to see what I've just tried to explain in generic terms. So I know that's probably not the reality, but that's what impressed me. And so, having said that, brother, what am I right about? What am I wrong about? What have I completely missed in my brief and abbreviated assessment, inshallah?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Brother Omar, for that introduction and also for another opportunity to share some thoughts with your good self and the viewers. Before I begin, may I just take a moment or
Of
two
course.
to my customary dua? Yes. Like when you said that, I'm wondering what I have missed. Well, what I was thinking of that, I have been asking myself the same question actually. So there are
Mhm,
two of us here,
mhm,
because obviously, I started out as a student of political philosophy when I
mhm,
was working with the Friends of Leo Strauss back at the University of Toronto. And don't get me wrong, they're really outstanding scholars, and they have a very,
mhm,
very disciplined, focused approach. Perhaps I have some differences in terms of the relationship between reason and revelation, because as I have mentioned before, they tend to draw a rather sharp distinction between the two. They refer to it as the Jerusalem-Athens, alternative. In
mhm,
other words, they take the view that either you are religious and you accept things on faith, or else you are following you are rational or you are rationalist in some sense or another. In other words, they saw these two as somehow incompatible or mutually exclusive. So they sometimes, and others sometimes refer to it as the so-called tension between reason and revelation.
Yes.
And I hasten to add that when I use the word revelation, I mean what in Arabic is also rendered as tanzil, which is rendered in English as that what which Allah has sent down. Now, another word which is used for revelation is the term wahi, which is sometimes rendered as inspiration. Now, we have to be careful to differentiate between the two, because we know from the Quran that Musa's mother received wahi or inspiration when she was inspired to put the baby Moses into the basket on the river. The bees in the Quran have received inspiration to build their homes in places, homes of the people. The earth will get wahi, inspiration on Yawmul Qiyamah, and even Zakaria communicated to his people using wahi, that's the word used, using gestures to say that he could not speak to them. And also, let us not forget that even some of the evildoers inspire each other, as Allah informs us in the Quran, use a Quran using wahi. So inspiration can come from Allah, and it can come from people, or to people, or even from people, and it can even come from some evil sources. But that is never the case with tanzil, revelation understood as tanzil. Everything that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as tanzil, is also inspiration, but not all inspiration is tanzil or revelation. I hope that makes it clear.
Sure.
So when I use the word revelation, I mean it in a sense closer to, I'm in a sense of tanzil rather than what we normally think of as inspiration.
Of course.
So now, coming back to the idea, what have I missed? I suppose you know a little bit of my background. I grew up under communism, and we had a certain worldview and ideology, and we had good guys there in the classrooms. Pictures of Karl Marx, the president, Engels, or whoever was, these priests or whatever you want to call them of the religion called communism, because in a way it was also, and of course when I migrated to Canada, those names were taken off the walls, and instead now we have people like Churchill, our prime minister, and a different bunch of folks takes the place. So then I came to Malaysia, and again I had to take some pictures down and put others up there. Now we have the different people up there on the wall. So I was wondering what's going on here. I mean, there are so many different orientations and worldviews that are competing, ideologies that are all competing with one another for the allegiance of man. And of course, we have Islam. I don't want to call it an ideology, but it's a way of life. The word deen translates also roughly into a way of life, as the chap that interviewed me for my job at the Islamic Science University in Malaysia put it in his book, which I have read. The professor, do I need to mention his name? Perhaps that's not necessary, but a fine gentleman with the first degree from Medina and a PhD from one of the UK universities. So now, of course, even in the Western tradition, we have this concept of, so-called false consciousness, right? And several people have touched on this issue. It's very important in political theory, for example. Karl Marx had his own notion of a false consciousness, where the workers think that they are well off by serving their masters, the capitalists, and they think. And also, some people have tried to, justify this issue of practice of slavery as saying that, well, some people like to be in that condition. They don't like freedom. And in fact, one of the leaders, independence leaders, I think in South Africa, I don't recall exactly whether it was Bishop Desmond Tutu or was it Nelson Mandela, said that, we had a choice, between freedom and lunch. So
Mm-hmm.
if we chose freedom, we might lose our rice bowl, our lunch. But
Mm-hmm.
if we continue with our job, our rice bowl, then we will have lunch, but we may not have freedom. So there are these trade-offs that perhaps
Mm-hmm.
sometimes need to be made, and people fight, indeed, for freedom, like the Second World War was in some ways a fight over freedom, freedom represented by the Allies, and fascism or tyranny represented by the Nazi Axis powers. You see, so luckily, thank God, the supporters of freedom prevailed over the supporters of tyranny, and the so-called Übermenschen, or the Overmen, as they call themselves, were defeated by the so-called Undermen or the Untermensch. In other words, Allah turned the tables on them. And by the way, this ideology, the so-called master-slave dialectic, was worked out by George Friedrich Hegel in his Phenomenology of the Spirit, which is, a classic articulation of how history progresses through a series of conflicts between, from a theoretical point of view, we can think of it as a conflict between thesis, antitheses, and syntheses. So
Yes.
that, for example, when the French revolutionaries challenged the ancien regime, the French revolutionaries, the followers of reason, or the Enlightenment, if you like, they were the antitheses against the thesis represented by the monarchy. So there was a conflict called the French Revolution, and after this conflict emerged a synthesis in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte, who somehow retained elements of both. He was the emperor, so that was he retained that from the ancien regime, but he also believed in equality and human rights, what have you, rule of law, and so in that sense he incorporated elements of the antitheses. And by the way, I have found out recently that when Napoleon was sailing to Egypt, he read the Quran on the boat while he was sailing there, and towards the end of his life, he wrote some very positive things about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. So he was quite interested, actually, in Islam, and he wasn't alone. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher of reason, the author of the brilliant Critique of Pure Reason, also apparently had written Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim in Arabic on, I think it was it the invitation to some kind of dinner, or was it some kind of an award certificate? I don't recall that exactly. But what I am trying to say is that there was considerable interest among educated Europeans in Islam already back in those days. So now, having said all that, in terms of what went wrong, of course, we have done analysis of World War II, has been done extensively. Napoleon, okay. What went wrong in his case? Well, he shouldn't have aggressed. He invaded Russia. That was a big mistake. Allah does not love aggressors, you see. So if he had managed to stay away from that, maybe he would have lasted longer, so to speak. So now, but what about our Ummah? As you know, is also currently, many people have noted, including people, Sunni scholars, like they are sometimes referred to as neo-traditionalist Sunni scholars. I'm referring to Tahjabir Alwani, the former chairperson of the IIIT Institute in Herndon, Virginia, USA, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Then his colleague, Alwani was originally a scholar of Iraqi background, Al-Azhar PhD graduate. And then his colleague, Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, the second rector of the International Islamic University here in Malaysia, also both wrote some, I think, very remarkable books. I may not agree with everything they write, but 90, 80, 90, let's say make it 85% of what they write I can agree with. And they both note that the condition of the Ummah is dire. There's something went wrong, definitely, and they are trying to analyze what it is. And according to Abu Hamid Abu Sulaiman, in a book translated into English and published in 1993, the main problem began in the mind. He titled his book "The Crisis in the Muslim Mind." Excellent book, excellent reading. I have a sort of abridged version of it on academia with a little introduction, but the full text is available online in the English language in PDF format. You can download an excellent copy directly from the IIIT.org ORG Institute. And then he followed up that book and published 1993 with another book, excellent book, called Retrieving the Islamic Worldview, I believe is the title, that was published in 2011. And here he goes a step further and comes closer, in fact, to Taha Jaber Alwani, where when they both basically are coming to the agreement that what went wrong was that the Sunnah or the hadith, if we use those expressions the way that Al-Shafi used them, because to Al-Shafi the Sunnah was pretty much the same as the hadith. The Sunnah, after all, is based on a hadith. So both of these neo-traditionalist scholars, Abu Sulaiman and Taha Jaber Alwani, basically agree that what went wrong was that the Sunnah has somehow overshadowed the Quran and become so prominent at the expense of the Quran that Taha Jaber Alwani even goes so far as to say that the Ummah, and this is verbatim, I quote, abandoned the Quran almost entirely, end of quote, almost entirely. And there's a famous verse in Al-Quran, Surah 25, verse number 30, where Allah himself says that the Prophet Muhammad will say on Yawmul Qiyamah, "Oh my Lord, my people are treating this Quran as something to be rejected or abandoned." So
Yes.
Allah himself predicts that there will be a turning away from the Quran towards something else, and kind of like a change in Qibla, if you like, a change of direction, a change of focus away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet, peace be on him. Now, what do we make of this? Is this a correct diagnosis of what went wrong? Because this momentous change was partly triggered by the emergence of the hadith, which started in the 700s, and also it was partly triggered by conflicts that began to develop between the madhabs, as you were saying. We are now coming to the madhab, about the best way to understand the Book of Allah. The so-called Ahlil al-Ray, or the people of opinion, represented by Abu Hanifa, argued in favor of, using reason, rationalism, and Abu Hanifa, according to a book by Daniel Brown called Rethinking Tradition in Modern Islamic Thought, Abu Hanifa would only accept, he didn't reject all the hadiths, but he would only accept verbatim hadiths as reliable. In other words, the hadiths had to be the exact words of the Prophet, not paraphrases, as actually, if I'm not mistaken, practically all, I would think all the hadiths actually are paraphrases. There's not a single verbatim hadith, except of course for the best hadith, which is the Quran itself. The Book of Allah refers to itself as the best hadith, Ahsanul hadith, and also it presents itself as the best tafsir, Ahsanul tafsir. So these are arguments that are often used by Ahlul Quran, or people who follow the Quran only, which, by the way, the Prophet himself also did, I would like to emphasize. So that people who think that the followers of Quran only are somehow deviating from Islam, they should remember that the Prophet himself followed only the Quran. He certainly did not follow Bukhari, Nasai, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, or any of the other compilers of the traditions. He never even heard of them. And we are advised, and he was advised in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to pursue that of which he had no knowledge. So if the Prophet himself had no knowledge of these hadith books, by the way, I'm not rejecting them out of hand. I still make allowance for them to be used for purposes of getting some information about the past, but definitely not as legislation, definitely not as binding, and definitely not as explaining the Quran, and definitely not as equal to or even superior in some ways to the Quran. I was astonished to hear Brother Dr. From Georgetown University, Jonathan Brown, say in one video that the Hadith, the Sunnah, is more powerful than the Quran. I was absolutely shocked. Well, how can he possibly make such a statement? When Allah says that if this Quran had been revealed onto a mountain, the mountain would crumble. Yet here Dr. Brown is telling us that the Sunnah basically a collection of hearsay. I'm sorry for being so blunt. He's telling us that this collection of hearsay, which would not be accepted as evidence even in an ordinary court of law, let alone a Sharia court, the ulama have made this hearsay into a second source of legislation. This is absolutely shocking. And I'm not alone. Even Jabir al-Wani expresses reservations, and he states in his book, Reviving the Balance, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only lawgiver in matters of religion. There is no second source, so to speak. And even ijma is very problematic to say that consensus of the scholars can be a source of the law. Similarly, for analogy. Analogical reasoning is not a source of the law. It could be at best understood as a methodology of arriving at some rulings. For example, to outlaw riba al-fadl, which is the riba of excess, which is reported on in the hadith corpus. The riba al-fadl is not mentioned in the Quran. The riba that the Quran mentions is riba al-nasiya, the riba or interest or usury that is attached, the increase that is attached onto loans when they are being repaid. So since the principle of riba is the same in both cases, which is the inequality of the counter values exchanged, then the Prophet can apply through analogical reasoning the prohibition of riba from the Quran, which applied to loans, also to a prohibition of riba in sales transactions, because the illah, the cause of the prohibition, is the same in both cases. It is the inequality of the counter values exchanged, and because this inequality actually represents injustice, and that is why the riba is prohibited, because it is a form of injustice and exploitation.
Yes,
so now,
that's what it is.
So now to come back to the madhahib, I did notice one only a matter of days ago that something that struck me as a pattern. So let me try it out, and maybe you can tell me if you can see anything wrong with this argument. So far, I have not been able to find any major holes in it, but you never know, there might be some. But I noticed as I was, actually I'm trying to complete another book, and I have a section there called The Battle of the Books, and I touch on the imams. And by the way, I'd like to add, if I may just add, I should probably add a footnote to what I was mentioning earlier in terms of the tension between the two groups, between the so-called Ahlul al-Rai, the people of opinion, and the Ahlul Hadith. Actually, this was another sort of thought that I somehow, I don't know how do I describe it, pop into my brain, but it occurred to me that when I was reading the account of Imam al-Shafi struggling against his opponents, he does not, it seems, identify his opponents as the Ahlul al-Rai. No, he identifies them by a different name. And that other name is Mutakallimun, the theologians. And who were the theologians? Well, they were the Ahlul Kalam. And what does Kalam mean here? Well, the Kalam here means the word of Allah, the book of Allah, in other words, the Quran. So his dispute was actually, how do I put this? Let me put it this way. Let me put it cautiously. His dispute was, let's say, as much with the Ahlul al-Rai, the followers of Abu Hanifa, as it was, or can I be a little bolder and say, it seems to me that his dispute was more with the Ahlul Kalam than with the Ahlul al-Rai. In other words, the real dispute here was not so much a dispute between the followers of opinion, which is, and the followers of the Hadith, of tradition, which is the account that we get from Jabir al-Wani, for example. He puts the tension, the struggle in those terms. But perhaps that tension is better understood as a tension or a clash, if you like, between not the people of opinion and the people of the tradition, but rather the people, the Ahlul Quran or the Ahlul Kalam and the followers of tradition. In other words, What the real tension was between the followers of the Quran and the followers of the Hadith. Let me put it
Yes.
very, very directly. And if this is the case, that would be quite significant, because then the followers of the Hadith traditions, they have some more explaining to do than we have been led to believe. They have to explain to us, why is it that you are struggling against the people of the Quran? And if I'm not mistaken,
Why?
there was
Exactly.
why? Where do you get the audacity to struggle against people who are following the Quran, just like the Prophet himself, peace be on him, did? What is your rationale? Please explain yourself. So that's one point I wanted to highlight. And in fact, there was a fellow, I was watching one of his videos earlier, saying that in Hadith number 250, I think, was it Ibn Majah, the Prophet refers to the people closest to Allah as Ahlil Quran. So this expression is encountered in the Hadith corpus. So, but the expression, now what about the expression Ahlil Hadith? Ahlil Sunnah is not mentioned in the Quran. And even the Sunnah of the Prophet is not mentioned in the Quran. Now, I take the view that I still believe that, yes, the Prophet did have a Sunnah, but it is not what we hear from our Sunni brothers and sisters.
Yes.
The Sunnah of the Prophet was plain and simple: to follow the Quran, to follow the Book of Allah, which is what he was commanded to do. He was commanded to recite the Quran and to follow it. And the explanation was up to Allah. Allam al-Quran, Surah 55, I think verse number 2. Then also verse 19 in Surah 75, Qiyamah, Allah says, Inna alayna bayana. It is on us to explain it. Now, interestingly, perhaps I can mention this without intending any malice, that when Taha Jabir al-Wani was trying to make his case, because he believes that the Sunnah helps to elucidate, he uses the word elucidate, and sometimes he uses the word clarify the Quran. When he was trying to make his case, he interestingly quoted Surah 75, the one I mentioned, and he quoted verses 16, 17, and 18, but then he stopped short and did not quote verse number 19, where Allah says, Inna alayna bayana, it is on us to explain it. Now, why didn't Professor Al-Wani quote that verse? Well, if he wanted to be less than charitable, you might say that he didn't quote it because it would have undermined his whole case of postulating the Sunnah as something that explains the Quran. Now, how did that happen? You know, I think when we deal with people's arguments, we have to present the opponent's argument in the strongest possible way. Sometimes we even have to help him or her to make the argument better, and not somehow weaken it by leaving out a very important part of the argument that would, make the other party's argument much more credible and strong. For some reason, Professor Al-Wani refrained from referring to that verse. I was quite disappointed, really, quite frankly. But of course, I'm not going to ascribe him any evil motives, but it was, I think, a significant oversight on his part, I have to say. By the way, this happens on page 75 in the book called Reviving the Balance. I remember the page number because it's the same number as the surah to which he was referring to, so that is easy to remember. So those readers who want to check whether what I'm saying is actually concurs with reality, please go ahead, be my guest, and I challenge them too to find any holes or gaps in my arguments. I am ready to be corrected. Obviously, this is all work in progress for us. But now to come to the second sort of insight that I was mentioning, that I only realized, I thought of this just a matter of days ago. When I was looking over these madhabs, I realized that, hey, wait a minute, there seems to be a pattern here. We have four imams. We have Abu Hanifa, born in 699 and died in 767, the same year as Imam al-Shafi was born. Now, then we have, after Imam Abu Hanifa, we have Imam al-Malik. And then we have Shafi, and then finally we have Ibn Hanbal. And there seems to be a change that takes place in the work of these imams as time goes by. Imam Abu Hanifa seems to have been the most stringent in his requirement in how he looked at the hadiths, the traditions. As I mentioned earlier, they had to be verbatim, the exact words of the Prophet, in order for him to consider them seriously. In other words, he would not accept paraphrase or transmission by meaning. The Arabic word is ma'na. That was not good enough for him. So now, and by the way, he had this in common with the Ahlul Quran, also rejected hadith as unreliable. Actually, they rejected all the hadiths. They wouldn't even accept, I think, the verbatim hadith. So now comes Imam al-Malik, who was, by the way, Imam al-Shafi's teacher, as you may know. And he actually started the first collection of hadiths, which I think we did not mention it in our last discussion, but better late than never. The name of his collection is called the Muwatta of Imam al-Malik, and that was apparently the first collection. But apparently this collection was not recommended by people like al-Shafi to be included in so-called 6 major books of hadith, right? It is not among them. So some people claim that he was leaning towards the Quran, a little bit like Abu Hanifa, or quite a bit, perhaps. This is a matter of interpretation. But could we possibly, put both Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam al-Malik on the one side and say, well, they were, I'm not saying that they were purely Ahlul Quran, but they had certainly a preference for the Quran. And of course, Imam Malik, as we noted last time, he would sometimes follow the tradition of the people of Medina in preference to some of the hadiths. Now, next comes Imam al-Shafi, who opened the door more widely to the hadiths, and he would not only make accept the hadiths transmitted in paraphrase, in other words, by meaning. He did not insist that the hadiths had to be verbatim like Abu Hanifa did. He didn't only accept hadiths in paraphrase or transmitted by meaning. He even made the hadiths into a second source of law. Now, that is a big, big step. He introduced what is known as the concept of dual revelation, Wahi Ain, and as I was saying earlier, if by revelation you mean only inspiration, perhaps you could, treat the hadith as something that was inspired, but not in a sense that it was sent down like Tanzil. By the way, Aisha Musa has a paper on academia on the concept of dual revelation, Wahi Ain, as it is called. I think the shall I say, mistake of the ulama was not so much that they, incorporated the hadith corpus into the general body of the heritage of Islam, but the mistake was in how they did it, you see. The moment that they began to treat the hadith, okay, you could still say the hadith is revelation of some sort, in the sense of inspiration, but not sent down by Allah, not as tanzil. But when they declared that the hadith is equal to the book of Allah, that's where they, I believe personally, they crossed the red line. That was a no-no. And they justified crossing this red line by, I think, fabricating a hadith, according to which the Prophet allegedly said that, I quote, I was given 2 things, the Quran and something equal to it, the hadith. End of quote. That is how the quotation is found. I quoted it verbatim on Ibn Baz website, the chief cleric of Saudi Arabia at that time. I'm not sure. So that was the mistake, to treat the hadith as equal to the Quran. And actually, they didn't stop there, as we have discussed before. They even elevated it above the Quran.
And you're saying that Hanifa was the first one to do this?
No. Imam al-Shafi was the first one to do this.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I still
not
get confused with these names. Shafi'i. Okay.
Yeah,
he was
Shafi
the first one. He was the first one to elevate the hadith to a dual relationship with the Quran, and maybe even above. Oh,
Yes, correct. Because
okay.
even though he says in his
Mm-hmm.
Risala that only the Quran can abrogate the Quran, which is a mistake already,
Mm-hmm.
there's no abrogation in the Quran by the Quran,
Yes,
or
of course.
and that he also claims that only the Hadith can abrogate Hadith. Yet, if you look at his acceptance of the Hadith on stoning to death for adultery or the death penalty for apostasy, you
Mm-hmm.
can see clearly that he is departing from his own rule, and he is
Mm-hmm.
allowing the Hadith to abrogate the Quranic verses, which is another major significant, let's call it faux pas, a
Yeah.
blunder on his part, I
So,
would say.
well,
Sorry if I
let's
may.
put this in perspective,
Yeah, go ahead.
if you may,
Go
if I
ahead.
may. Um,
Yeah.
According to your knowledge, which is the largest madhab?
Hanafi
Madhab,
Mazhab is the largest. Correct.
the Hanafi.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so
Second largest
uh,
would be the Shafi, I think.
the Shafi'i. Okay, so that's kind of the Muslim world is kind of split in half, and they don't even realize what they're
Yeah,
split over.
yeah, right. So
If
now,
I, yeah,
yeah,
I've had several conversations with people. They don't actually understand what's taken place here, with
yeah,
with how you're putting it in
yeah,
perspective,
right,
with the
right.
Hadith eclipsing. You see,
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
the Al Quran. You
Yeah, it's
see,
amazing. So,
yeah,
yeah,
okay,
just to finish the analysis, now
sure,
we come to what we have seen here is that Imam al-Shafi treats the hadith more liberally, if I can use that word, than Abu Hanifa.
okay,
You see, so now we come to so
Hanbal,
let me redo that. Imam
mm-hmm.
al-Malik, the strictest is Abu Hanifa when it comes to treating the hadith. He has the highest standards. The hadith must be
Yes,
verbatim, otherwise he won't accept
mm-hmm.
it. Now,
Okay,
Imam Malik accepted even hadiths that, were not verbatim, but he sometimes prioritized the custom of the people of Medina.
mm,
Now, here comes
okay,
Shafi, the third Imam, and he opens the door even more widely to the hadith
mm,
by now designating it as a second sort of a source of the Sharia of Islamic law.
mm-hmm.
But now we have one more Imam after him, you see,
Yes,
Imam Ibn Hanbal, who was died in 855 and was born, I think, in 780. So he comes at the end of these four Imams. And interestingly, he is very much against reason and rationality, so
mm-hmm.
much so that not only he does not, permit the use of akal or reason to understand revelation, he even applies this rule to understanding of the hadith.
Mm-hmm.
So he puts the greatest emphasis on hadith at the expense of reason. While
Mm-hmm.
when we began with Imam Abu Hanifa, he placed a great deal of emphasis on reason and very little emphasis on hadith. So
Mm.
what we see here is a kind of change in the relationship between reason and tradition.
Yeah, it's almost
Reason,
180 degrees.
exactly. So
Yeah.
Abu Hanifa, known as a rationalist, one of the Ahlul Rai, sees
Mm-hmm.
a major role for reason in understanding, interpreting, and applying revelation, the Book of Allah.
Mm-hmm.
Then comes Imam Malik, who opens the door a little bit wider to the hadith than Abu
Yeah.
Hanif. Then comes Imam al-Shafi, who opens the door even more widely to the hadith. And then comes Imam Ibn Hanbal, who shuts the door to reason, and now hadith becomes really very, very prominent. So what we see here is a gradual, and by the way, these people lived within a 150-year period, you see.
Yes. Yes.
Imam Abu Hanifa was born 699. Imam Ibn Hanbal died in 855. That's 156
Mm-hmm.
years later. The
Yes.
first
Yes.
two Imams actually were contemporaries. They lived
Mm-hmm.
for a while together at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. And the last three Imams also were contemporaries for a while, you see. So it was a very small world. And by the way, with this growing emphasis on tradition and hadith and this bias developing against the reason and rationalism and rationalists, guess what happened in 786 when Imam Shafi was only 19 years old? Do you remember that great slaughter of the philosophers?
Yes.
5,000 of
Yes.
them.
Yes.
That's what happened exactly in the middle of this process where reason was being displaced and perhaps replaced by tradition, you see.
Uh-huh. Oh, mass murder.
Yeah,
Okay.
well,
Hmm.
I think there's probably some connection here, but we can come back to that
Yeah. Yeah.
another
Okay.
time. What I'm trying
So,
to
Han,
point out, yeah,
if
go
I
ahead,
understand you correctly,
go ahead.
I'm sorry for butting
That's all
in, but
right,
if
no
I
problem.
understand you correctly, and I'm doing this for the sake of our listeners, Hanbali and my own understanding, Hanbal, even on Hanbal, became the first dyed-in-the-wool traditionalist, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
he wouldn't eat watermelon just because the prophet never ate watermelon. That doesn't like
Yes,
seem like a
yes,
very
of course.
reasonable
Right.
approach.
Mm-hmm.
But so there's a tendency here. Anti-rationalism is growing, and
Mm-hmm.
sorry, yes, anti-rationalism growing, and as
Mm-hmm.
traditionalism is also rising. So reason is being suppressed, and tradition is being elevated, and that's how we get the so-called subordination of akal to nakal, the
Mm-hmm.
subordination of the intellect or rationality to tradition. The
Yes.
traditional scholars basically claim that we have to follow even the weakest hadith, and even if it goes against, how do I put this? To borrow the words of my former mentor,
I
Professor
want to
Muhammad
hear.
Kamali, he says that scholars said that we have to follow hadith even when, I quote, it goes against the dictates of reason, end of quote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in other words,
Mm-hmm.
we have to throw reason, rationality under the bus. We go with the hadith.
And Allah
Now,
gave us reason. Yeah.
exactly. So this is completely anti-Quran. It goes
Yeah,
against the
of
Quran
course.
because Allah says, "Afala
Mm-hmm.
taqilun." Allah talks a lot about tafakkur, reflecting, tadabbur, meditating. Allah
Yes.
says in verse 100, Surah number 10, that He will place ridges or confusion or filth on the people who don't use their reason. He refers
Yes.
to the people who don't use their reason in Surah 8, verse 22, as the worst of creatures, the worst
Yes.
of creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So, despite all these admonitions to use our reason, the scholars are telling us exactly the opposite. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what do you make of that? I think that's one of the things that went wrong, seriously
Yeah.
wrong. So,
Mm.
how can you follow something you do not understand? How can you follow
Yeah.
the Quran if you are not prepared to use your mind, your brain to understand it? Yet, this is what the
Yeah.
traditional ulama are saying. But there's a
Exactly.
couple more things that happen. You see,
Mm-hmm.
for a time from 809 until 852, I think the rationalists got the upper hand under Al-Ma'mun and some of his family. And the rationalists were in a saddle, so to speak. And that was the time that they, starting with Harun al-Rashid, they started Baitul Hikmah. They translated works from foreign languages into, that was the so-called Islamic Golden Age. While the Muslim Ummah was rational or rationalistic, that was the Golden Age of Islam. So,
Mm-hmm.
but that changed in 852 when Mutawakkil reversed the policy of the rationalists and put the traditionalists back in the saddle. So now
Mm-hmm.
the entire process of the persecution of rationalists was restarted, resumed, and thinkers were once again chased out of their homes, sometimes killed, their books were burned, and about 150 years later, at the turn of the millennium, even the gates to ijtihad or the license to, issue fatwas by the scholars, even that was officially prohibited by one of the caliphs. In other words, what we have witnessed here is a complete shutdown of the Muslim mind, the closing of
Mm-hmm.
the Muslim mind, officially closed by
Mm-hmm.
political decree. And then, as if that was not enough, comes Imam al-Ghazali 100 years later, and he puts a final nail in the coffin of rationalism by writing his
Mm-hmm.
critique of the philosophers, the
Mm-hmm.
Tahafut,
Yeah.
where
Mm-hmm.
he identifies philosophers with, atheists, and recommends the death penalty basically for them. So what we are seeing here, the long-term trend is away from rationalism towards traditionalism and towards the hadith, towards traditionalism, and I would even think, and also with the decrease of the emphasis on rationalism, there's also a decrease of emphasis on the Quran and increasing
Mm-hmm.
emphasis on the hadith. You see, so there's a
Mm-hmm.
gradual
Yeah.
movement away from both reason and revelation understood as the Quran, and in favor of tradition is becoming more and more bigger and bigger and more prominent. According to Taha Jaber Rawani, actually, the way the scholars justified focusing on the Sunnah was by saying, well, but the Sunnah includes the Quran, so there's no need to refer to the Quran. And as a scholar in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates, he wrote a couple of papers. You can find them online. His name is Sultan Butti Sultan Ali Al-Muhairi, and the name of the paper is called Sharia in the United Arab Emirates, modern and pre-modern period. There are two papers, and in one of the papers he says that basically the ulama have relegated what they considered before to be the primary sources, although I believe there's only one primary source, the Quran. What they considered to be the primary sources into remote sources. They became remote, and for all practical purposes, the works of the scholars, their predecessors, became their primary reference. They were in fact prohibited from referring to the primary sources. So what the conclusion that I want to sort of crown all this with, I want to use a strong word, but please correct me if you think it is too strong. But I think what we are witnessing here is not just a mere, assault on reason, a departure, drifting from the Book of Allah, from Revelation, and not merely a rise in the importance of tradition. And by the way, the Quran tells us very clearly not to follow the traditions of our forefathers, and that is exactly what the Ummah did when they abandoned the Quran in favor of the traditions.
Yes,
but we
it
are
seems that
witnessing,
way.
let me put it cautiously, we may be witnessing something even worse than all this, which is, can I say, a rise of fanaticism? What do you
Yes.
think, brother? Thank you.
Well, it's an extreme position because on the one hand you have the right-brained approach and you have the left-brained approach, but the pendulum.
There's a third approach, brother. If I may just,
Yes,
the
okay.
no-brain approach.
The no-brain approach. Okay.
No-brainer.
Well, I'm being
Generous, yeah.
kind because if you get struck on one extreme or the other, let's say if you have the right brain approach, then you become a Sufi extremist. If you have the left brain approach, then you become the Arabist extremist who's Sunnah only, but Islam is the middle path. So every time you get to one end or the other, you should pause, tafakkur, and then come back to the middle, you see. And this is an ongoing process, this swinging back and forth from right to left. And we use this politically speaking at the right, and the left. And, the aisles aren't supposed to meet, but every time they have a quiet soiree behind closed doors, the Republicans and the Democrats or the Tories and the Labor, they're meeting and saying, hey, well, that propaganda program worked well. What are we going to do next? You see, as they're chugging down their champagne. This same thing happened to Islam, it seemed to me. So it is a form of extremist, and it's a form of politicizing a religion, if you will, and keeping people divided as opposed to unified. And that's what we're getting at here. That's why I say, okay, well, let's pursue this madhab again next week, because I think that they were intelligently used to keep the people divided on either side of the Sufi Shia divide, if you will, and either side of this fundamentalist versus Sufi, divide. I meant to say Sunnah Shia divide. So this division is not a unity. It's not Tawheed. It prevents Tawheed. It prevents Tawheed because it prevents the use of reason. And either way, you see, whether you're right-brained or left-brained here in your approach to the deen, according to these religious misunderstandings, okay, you're becoming taqlidish. You're just blind following the traditions. And that's what we're getting at here. And I want to thank you for making it, again, abundantly clear that this is what happened. Because many of our young listeners, they need to understand this from an academic, historical, and philosophical evolutionary process, because that's what took place. So here's where socio-political biases turn people into taqlid traditionalists, whether of the right or of the left, because what they're doing, what you said here is very important. And I saw this when I walked into many a Sufi tariqat. You see, they have a they have this sort of center like you have in the um, the places of prayer where there's an empty spot, supposed to represent the prophet once stood there. But they also have the picture of their leaders. You see, their master, the one who's sitting on the diet, and when they do their devotions, they're bowing also to his picture, which is a kind of idolatry. So what you've just described here is idolatry, or even on the part of the Sunnis, who have abandoned Sufism to greater or lesser degrees, some of them, and have accepted this fundamentalist, taqlidist approach to elevating the tradition above the Quran. And so they don't look at the Quran, or if they do, it's just a formality of recitation, you see, without comprehension. And I met so many of them, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. But they replaced this with an image in their mind of their madhab leader. No, I don't think the madhab leaders had this in mind when they entered the grave. So I don't think the death angel was inquiring about that. But I think this is something that happened to their students, and I would like to explore that later, because in the establishment of any religion, no matter what it is, all over the world, this has consistently happened. And it consistently happened on the grand scale, and also the macro scale and the micro scale. Okay, so if we just look at the madhabs, okay, well, there's some competition's okay. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. You have a little bit of opposition, and you get pushed against, and then you have to understand, well, what are you pushing for? I mean, if you're going to stand your ground, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with competition, but the whole point of competition is to get to a point where we agree upon the perceived truth, what it is that we're able to perceive of it. I mean, look, this new telescope just went up, and it's taking another look at the skies, and oh, lo and behold, what they predicted would never happen, it's discovered has happened. And this discovery recently has destroyed the Big Bang theory, which makes the Big Bang obsolete. It doesn't make any other observations obsolete, but that Big Bang was a hypothesis. Now it's destroyed because of this new telescope that's gone up. So I think that's wonderful. And we're trying to do the same thing here. Okay, we're going to destroy all these hypothetical positions, and let's get to the reality. And what is the reality? Well, the reality is only what we can see. See? So we couldn't see beyond the Hubble telescope, that was sent up 20 years ago. Now we can see a new one, and gosh, because we can actually see it, it changes our whole perspective, you see. And then, this hypothesis, which has been held as sacred for so long by so many previous astrophysicists, is done away with. And they're speechless, you see. They don't know what to say. Well, the Sunnis, who are genuinely interested in the truth, they should also become speechless in the face of what we're discussing here. And they should say, oh my God, is that what really happened? Well, gosh, we have to change our hypotheses then. That means that what we were believing, just because we were told by somebody we don't know, you see, is, hey, that's where it starts. I saw this in a Sufi textbook, one of these coffee table books, hardbound, big one, oversized, I was sitting in the house of a member of the royal family in Kuala Lumpur, and he went to answer the phone, and I'm sitting in his living room, and there's this big coffee table book there. So I opened it up, and it's about his tariqat and the history. Well, they couldn't trace the history any further back than 200 years after the death of our prophet. And so what they said, well, the beginning of this tariqat was the result of a vision that somebody had during a dream, where they met so and so in the dream, and they said, "You start this tariqat. This is the real inspiration. We're going to sort everything out here." And I said, "Well, Jesus, I've seen these same stories in the histories of other cults, doing the same thing. It all starts with some dream and vision of some stranger who says he's so and so, when in fact you'll have no evidence for that, because these other unseen creatures, they can mess with your visions and dreams and give you misdirection, and you'll think it's holy, you'll think it's sacred, you see. And so the madhabs have been taken as a sacred position, and this tradition has been taken as a sacred tradition, and it's not sacred. It's a expression of humanism, is what it is, because these individuals have set themselves and their sayings and their opinions above Al Quran. See, and all based on hearsay. Oh my God! Oh my God! Well, I want to thank you very much, brother, and I want to continue this. So please, whatever you're reading on these madhabs and whatever you discover, please bring it to the table when we meet again. Inshallah, that will be next week. Anything you'd like to add, brother?
Yeah, just a footnote about how the Hadith collection actually started. I had intended to mention this earlier,
Yes.
but what I wanted to say, what I would like to say is that many people don't realize, including myself until quite recently, that the first Hadith collection, that was Muwatta by Imam Malik, was actually undertaken in response to a request by a caliph to do so, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So Malik was under political pressure to do this. And the caliph that advised him to do it was, I think, Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid caliph. And before Al-Mansur, there was another caliph. His name was Umar II. He actually ordered the collection and the recording of the hadith. He sent out a general sort of order around his realm for people to do that. So... and he, in fact, according to Tahajabir Rawani, by the way, which is the source of this information, Umar the second was in fact the first person who openly, publicly claimed that the prohibition of the Prophet's prohibition of the recording and narration, transmission of hadith was abrogated. So this is what Umar claimed, that the Prophet abrogated his original prohibition of the recording and transmission of the hadith. And Umar had to make this claim, I suppose, otherwise he could not justify his order for people to start writing down whatever they heard from the Prophet, you see. So what the reason I mention these two events is to highlight that the collection of the hadith had a political beginning. It was done under compulsion from the powers that be, and we are told in Islam that there is no compulsion in the religion. Well, it looks like there was some compulsion in the collection of the hadith. So it was done under duress, you might say, political duress. And so what does that do to the integrity of the collection process when it is not, it didn't happen as a result of some kind-hearted old man decided to start collecting what he thought were the sayings of the Prophet. No, he was doing it under orders from the political ruler. And you know what happens to people that disobey orders? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Why did so many Nazi collaborators say after the war that, well, we only followed orders?
Yes,
right?
yes, of course.
So I just wanted to highlight the political beginnings of these hadith collections. I think it's a very important point to remember. Thank you.
This was a natural developmental process that followed the political interest rather than the interest on behalf of Al-Quran. You see, it's very plain to see. All right, then. Well, with that being said, dear brother, thank you once again, and I hope that the high heaven that we can meet again next week and continue this discussion, inshallah. Wassalamu
Inshallah.
alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brother. Thank you.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. And thank you too, brother.